Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this episode of our webinar. It's great to see so many of you here today. Today I have with me Leanne Gardiner, who is Transformation Director in InHealth organisation. She's going to tell us a bit about what that organisation does and what her role is in a second. But I'd like to thank you all for joining. At the bottom of the screen, there's a chat function, so please put any questions into that as we go. And we're going to be focusing really on our key topic today of humanizing shared services, humanizing HR, and how and what that means and what we might learn from Leanne's experience. So Leanne, if I kick off with actually asking you to tell us a little bit about InHealth, what you guys have been doing, what you've been doing through the pandemic, and what your role is actually.
Thanks. So yeah, I've actually had two roles. So I'll go back to when the pandemic started. So I mean, InHealth as an organisation, we provide services to the NHS. We're very much in the diagnostic space, both from a mobile perspective and also from diagnostic centres in some of the major cities. So we very much sit in that space of helping people to get their diagnoses or their tests or examinations quicker. And obviously I'm very passionate about that. So when the pandemic started, like everyone, we panicked. We went into how on earth do we manage this? You know, this isn't something we'd walked through. This isn't something we'd done with our business continuity planning. We hadn't even thought of that. We were obviously, like every organisation, learning as we went. So that was the last 12 months, and I was the HR director for that entire time. And I've been the HR director for InHealth since 2014. So quite a long time. And then most recently in March, I joined into a new role for InHealth as the Transformation Director. And I'm focused very much at the moment on transforming our shared services back office functions to become even more patient facing and even more value adding.
So if I understand it, InHealth are not directly involved with the COVID testing and all this stuff, but the work's had to continue, presumably with the same kind of pressures of PPE, getting people to work, people being sick, and delivering the overall testing services you do in incredibly difficult circumstances.
Absolutely, and I think one of the biggest challenges for us was trying to work out how to keep those services running safely and keeping our staff safe. And even simple things were challenging at the beginning, things like getting our staff into hotels that were safe and clean, and there was very, very little guidance around how to do that. We had to take some very big decisions about how we looked after our staff. We were communicating regularly with them, you know, daily, hourly in some cases, to really make sure that we could do the best for them. Because obviously we were trying to keep the fires burning in terms of making sure that patients could get access to the treatments that they needed. And obviously very quickly we had to stand down those services through the lockdown initial period, and then obviously stand them back up very quickly as well. So we went through a very quick change curve, which in healthcare is not normal. And I think, you know, also the ability to transfer some of our staff to frontline was, you know, our staff were incredibly passionate about helping out during that period of time. And a lot of our staff, I think over 350 staff actually went and worked on the front line in some of the trust to support the pandemic fight. So we were incredibly proud to support that, but also obviously very, very pleased when we were able to return our services and our staff were able to return to what the new normal was with all the PPE and all the challenges that come with infection control.
Very interesting, yes. Yeah, that's very interesting that you describe health as a sector which is quite slow to change. I imagine pre-pandemic, risk assessments for even the smallest change in the service, presumably an enormous amount of baggage to get through to make any change, and then suddenly you're thrown into this different world. Now, before we go on to the main topic today, Leanne, can you explain to me, I've seen the in-house enormous trucks, which, you know, I mean, they're really beautiful things.
They are beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, so what exactly, well, that's the only real contact I've had with InHealth. So what's in that truck and what does it do?
So fascinating. So we have a fleet of over 100 of those now. And they travel around the country providing services in a trailer, and it is amazing. When you go into these trailers, you do not feel like you're in one. They are incredible pieces of kit. Yes, they are slightly different than the traditional. You know, you're going into a surgery or a healthcare centre or a hospital. You go onto our trailers and it's extremely efficient, but it's equally very, very supportive. And so we might have an MRI scanner in the back of them. We might have a CT scanner in the back of them. We might have an ultrasound. We might even have clinic rooms where we provide different types of diagnoses and examinations. So it's actually a very cool piece of kit. And they travel all over the country. So they can go for weeks on end or for months on end, but they go where the patients need them. And those have been incredibly useful during the pandemic to support some of the CT scanning that's been required. So we've been, very, very privileged to be able to help that part of the pandemic response for the NHS.
And I guess as a tool, because they're mobile, because of the way they work, presumably they've actually been quite handy in terms of social distancing, getting patients in and out of a building, but safely, etc. So that, which I guess nobody envisaged at the
absolutely not.
Built. Interesting. So that's really fascinating. So what I wanted to understand a bit more, Leanne, is a bit about your personal history and therefore your philosophy about delivering shared services and delivering HR. And then afterwards, we can move on to the conversation about what exactly you're doing at InHealth. So I do know a bit about your history, so I'm really interested in where your ideas and thoughts about HR and shared services have come from.
Yeah, so I was really lucky. I started my career in aviation a lot of years ago, and I wasn't actually in HR when I first began. I actually did a management traineeship, which was effectively like the apprenticeships of today. And I was really lucky not to have that direct route into HR because I was able to experience the business and how the business worked. And when I eventually did fall into HR, it was actually running the program that I was on, which was fantastic for me because I was really passionate about learning, development and progression and all of the things that came with being a trainee of learning every day. So for me, coming from that background, really, when I did hit HR, it was very much from an organisational development, organisational effectiveness perspective. Subsequent to that, I've held roles globally. I've held roles in the UK. I've held roles across different sectors. So I have done aviation. I've done consultancy. I've also done a stint with Dragon's Den's Peter Jones. I've also done a stint with pharma, and then most recently in healthcare. So I've had a very varied HR experience of small departments with very little infrastructure and teams, right the way through to large departments that have huge administrative burdens from legacy systems and also lots of regulation within my experience. So I've been really lucky to have that journey end to end and seen very, very different ways of doing things. I think the other thing that comes with that is seeing the ways that shared services are set up as well in different ways and how different departments deliver different things. And I think that's also been really helpful for me from an organisational perspective, because from a HR perspective, you have an oversight of the whole organisation. So both of those things have been really great.
What I'm really interested in is that to some extent it's quite unusual to have come from a customer-facing type organisation and going through that early training all about the customer, which British Airways, other airways specialise in, and then bringing that to HR. It is an unusual route. Most HR people have not, or many HR people, excuse me, those audience members who have, but many of us have not had that training in customer focus. And I'm really interested in what elements of that you bring to the shared service transformation you're doing now. So do you want to tell us a bit about the transformation you're doing? What does it mean, humanizing HR, and why is that the title of today's piece?
And that's really interesting because I think that's the whole premise is that we in HR and shared services, we have to remember we're also serving customers, even though they are internal. And I think that whole approach from aviation around customer experience, and I was very lucky to be indoctrinated in the Merry-Go-Over style of your customer is everything and delight your customer. So I think with HR and shared services, that's the foundational principle that I've used with entering the transformation program I'm now looking at. And very much when we were scoping the overall program out, Tom, we looked at a number of things that were really important. And one of the things that was important for me was that the customer has to have a good experience, but that only comes from the staff having a good experience. So when you talk about humanizing the HR element or any of those shared services functions, they have to feel it, they have to feel good, because if they feel good, they will make that customer feel good.
That's very interesting, and that is quite ambitious. So rather than what many of us do, which is try to modernize, make efficient, make effective our HR and other services, you're talking about something above and beyond that,
yes,
which is actually to almost try and delight the customers who you are serving, the
absolutely.
internal customers, etc. So that's quite unusual, Leanne. And how does that go down in your team? Because, you know, after all, it's just HR and finance services. What's this business about needing to delight the customer?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, it's really interesting talking to the people that we've got in our shared services function, and they really want to do that. And I'm going to give you an absolutely great example of this. One of our patient referral team, I was sat with them on the transformation project looking at one of the processes that they do with an email inbox and with referrals that we receive from GP surgeries. And I asked them, if I could automate what you're doing today, what would you spend your time doing? Now, obviously, you would think people would be scared, they would be worried about what the answer for that would be. And instead, this individual was so insightful, and I'll never forget that moment. It was a moment that matters in my experience. And this person said, well, I would absolutely spend my time supporting the GP surgeries to make sure they could refer easier and pull out all the stops to actually train them in the best way to get it through to our system, so that the patient could be seen quicker and it would remove the patient blockers. And I thought that was so poignant. I stopped in my tracks because I thought, this person is sitting there 7 hours a day triaging emails. And if they weren't doing that, because the robots can do that, if they weren't doing that, what they would do is something very special that has direct value impact on our customers, who are patients in this instance, and GP surgeries. So actually, that was a really poignant moment for me, and that's been echoed across all of our shared services conversations. And that's the approach we're very much taking, Tom. We want to go bottom up. We want to talk to the people on the ground. I'm yet to hit someone in shared services at InHealth that actually says, I want to spend my time every single day moving one piece of data for another for 7 hours a day. People want to add value. They want to feel connected to what they're doing. They want to feel connected to that experience. And so that customer approach, that absolute delighting the customer, it's invigorated and connected people in ways I would never have expected.
That's very interesting, because for most of us, many of us, we see the robotization of these kind of activities and as a dehumanization of the function. But you're describing something quite different, which is that actually having that robot team is allowing you to actually humanize and make it more direct.
Absolutely, and why not? You know, the robots are workers. You know, they don't have feelings, but they certainly have a place. And I think when I went into the project, I really wanted to humanize those robots, because I think it's really important for people to see them as fellow colleagues, rather than, they're not humans, but fellow colleagues to help them, just like you would as a team member. So we've done quite a bit of work, Tom, actually, on making sure that we induct the robots. We have humanized them by giving them names. We ran a competition with shared services to actually create an environment where they could have their own team members. We've actually done that. They've actually ended up being the Teenage Mutant Ninja Robots, which is just what the shared services team wanted to call them. And actually spending time with the robot, understanding how the robot works, understanding what its place is, and being really clear about what it can and what it can't do has been really important in that journey, because it really is about humans doing human work and not robots doing human work. The robots need to do the transactional, rules-based, methodical, linear processes that still add value, but they're not requiring that human element. So really being very clear that the robots need to do the stuff that is not human, and the humans need to do the human elements of the roles.
Now, it's often said that that shared services people aren't very good at defining their roles in process terms, not very good at envisaging how to automate areas of their process, etc. So, well, how did you get over that? So, how have you got your team? How have you created this automation, given that that's so what's your journey? How did that work?
Oh, Tom, I'm so passionate about this. This is so important. I think we've got to demystify process mapping and process engineering. It is not rocket science. It is very simple. And I think we worry about things that seem overly complex. We worry about things that we don't really understand. And actually, process mapping is very, very simple. So one of the things that we've done, and it's been really helpful, is we've actually partnered with UiPath. And they have a system called Automation Hub that helps to capture process that you're actually doing. That's been very helpful. However, before we did that, it was really important for us to really clarify what we were looking for our people to do. Because of course, you know, Tom, we hear it all the time. I can't possibly get the time to sit and map that 100-step process. So we broke it down. What we said is, don't map the whole process, just map the bits that are really, really painful. So map the bits that are transactional, that are rule-based, that actually they're where systems don't necessarily talk to each other, where you maybe are uploading documents to a file. Let's focus on those bits of the process. So don't worry about the whole process right now. Just worry about the bits that are painful. And when they then think about that, I talk to them about making a cup of tea. You know, if I ask you to just give me, how do you make a cup of tea in no more than 6 steps? Very simply, they can list it off. Well, I get a cup, I put the kettle on, and suddenly they start thinking in that process way. And when you start making it, life based, it makes it much easier for people to actually then think about the way that they do things.
That's very interesting. I'm thinking back to a conversation I had with the MOD a year or two ago on their deployment of robots for HR, actually, in their case. And surprisingly, they are not, well, maybe surprisingly, they're really advanced in doing this work. But they did it exactly the way you described. So, for example, on promotion boards, etc., there was an awful lot of paperwork which needed to be printed out and shared amongst the board who were doing that. I mean, great big stacks of it. And the truth was, it was taking several people, several days, if not weeks, to print off each of the individual documents and then put them on the table, etc., ready and distribute them. So it's a huge exercise and time consuming. So the question they originally thought about was, well, why don't we get rid of this paper, make it paperless, all this kind of stuff? And that was seen as too difficult a step. But instead, what they automated was simply the machine to do the printing, opening documents, printing them, collating them, and then making the stack. And that alone took weeks and weeks and weeks of effort of one of their, or in fact a team of their colleagues, who would be opening emails, opening Word documents, checking the Word document, printing them off, and then opening the next one, etc. So it wasn't, and what I like about that story is that they could have been more ambitious in doing more of the process. They could have retrained their generals, etc., to not use paperwork, etc. But actually just focusing on that core task made an enormous benefit without even, you know, and no doubt they've progressed subsequently and are making further inroads in the other areas, but just getting rid of that printing section. And then of course it had the other benefits, which was that the guys who used to do the printing were now able to check the material, weed out those CVs or cases which didn't hit the basic requirements of the board. So the quality, the amount of times the senior people came in and found a great big pile of stuff, and then on the last page went, well, hang on a second, this person's only been here 18 months, they don't qualify anyway. A lot of that was suddenly being taken away. So they were creating they were removing a thankless task which was being done badly, and then, as you say, kind of adding value to that process. I love that story because it's such a small thing, and yet has created such a difference.
Yeah, and I think that the second point that you just raised there, Tom, is actually really important as well. You know, the removal of errors. You know, I think that's something that when I've spoken to some of our shared services people around some of the processes that they really want to look at automating, the biggest issue is that the amount of rework, the time of reworking something where there's an error. So your example with the MOD is replicated with something like supplier onboarding in our procurement team, or something like levers within our HR processes. So actually those things, when they are right first time, you remove that 20 minutes, half an hour per one to have to rework it if somebody's keyed in a wrong date or something changes. So actually that error rate is actually really critical factor as well in the whole kind of engagement of the people that we're transforming with.
And that's quite an interesting part in the process mapping side of things, because we've all been involved in transformation programs and the need to map processes in detail. But one of the process areas which is kind of overlooked and hard to map is checking. It's checking. What do you do during the day? Well, I do all this stuff and then I do checking.
Yeah.
And that kind of that check process is incredibly important, and yet is very hard to map, because it is actually a human task. It is, it's very hard to describe what are the checks you do, but they're crucially important, and more time to do that is kind of makes the difference. Tell me, is InHealth using the same techniques in the service it's providing, and is that have you been able to lean on some of that expertise within InHealth to apply it to the shared service?
Yeah, we do have. I mean, obviously, we've got our patient excellence team that look at these things, and absolutely, there is some great work that they've been able to shape in terms of our approach here. But we haven't done any robotics or clear process mapping in our patient facing areas, and those ones tend to be through SOPs. So actually for us, we've taken that approach of really looking at how we can do things and some of the lessons learned and some of the great techniques that they use within clinical. But actually we've taken a slightly different approach with shared services, because this one is around really looking at how can we make people's lives better in shared services, but also the customers and the interactions that are coming externally to that team. So not just from the managers on the front line that desperately need to know X, Y, or Z, or the staff that are having a challenge and they can't get hold of their manager for whatever reason, or they need a piece of information, or they need a reference for their mortgage. Those things are really important. So what we've tried to do is to take the best practice from that patient-facing reviews and then mould that in with the new practices that we're seeing with our partner from UiPath, but also using some of the new agile ways of working, the new methodologies of working, and actually just trying some new things and seeing what works, and not being afraid to actually make a mistake. That's been quite a big thing for us the last few months, because when it's patient, you can't afford to make a mistake. You have to be absolutely meticulous. You can't afford to try something new and hope it works. So we've been a bit more agile with the shared services one, because there is obviously less risk with some of the processes we're doing, but we haven't not taken into account the way that they do some of those lessons learned and some of those approaches to re-engineering.
Interesting. So presumably COVID came along and all work on transformation stopped, Leanne.
Yes, very much so. Well, I mean, when it came along, I was in my HR director role, so we had plans for moving our HR system into the cloud, moving our system so they can connect through APIs, moving into using things like Power Automate in the Office 365 piece. All those things went on hold. So I'm just in a pet question. No, he's actually a very nice man. So we had to put that on hold, and it was really interesting because the timing for us as an organisation, Tom, was really interesting, because we just launched Teams. We just started to test the water in the ways of working with teams. but it wasn't as quick as uptake as I think we'd planned. And I was kind of one of the early adopters and one of the champions of teams internally, because I love systems, clearly. And we were a little bit worried that people were really not transitioning to use Teams in the best way that it could be used. So actually the pandemic helped us, because what it did is it rocketed everyone. I mean, everyone wouldn't even think twice now about logging into a Teams call, training via Teams, remote training and learning, remote team meetings, calls regularly of updates. None of those things were happening pre-pandemic. So I think it's been quite seismic, the pandemic, for some of our transformation digitally. That has, I think, really provided a much warmer and much softer foundation for us to then launch our transformation program, had we been doing it last year without the pandemic happening.
Right. So some of the transformation outcomes were actually driven by the COVID crisis, but other ones were delayed. So
Yes.
Moving to the cloud is a good question. So is that still on the agenda, Leanne? Is it, and where does it sit on the priorities in?
Well, it was one of the priorities that I kicked in even with pandemic. So I was very passionate about it. I have been very passionate about the HR system being able to deliver a better experience, and it couldn't do that unless it was on the cloud, because it just doesn't talk to any other system. So I was really passionate about that. So we actually made that transition in October. So that was something that was really important, because we have a number of best in breed systems. We don't have one enterprise system. We've got lots of best in breed, some already in cloud, some legacy based. And the aim was to move all of those systems to the cloud. And we actually achieved that through absolute blood, sweat and tears in the HR team. They worked absolutely tirelessly to get that done. And now we're benefiting from the progression that we planned pre-pandemic with that cloud-based move. And it will also support, because the robot we launched last week for, and it's in deployment and testing at the moment, for levers process, would never have worked if that was not in the cloud. We would never have been able to do what we're doing now had we not made that move in October. So the steps were quite important to take before we undertook where we are now.
That's quite interesting, though. But you are describing actually a transformation which is not linear, by the sound of it. So actually, some things which are transformative were going on in parallel to others, and not waiting to get into the cloud to start that exercise, but actually doing the other parts. I mean, I'm very interested in the moment in how moving to the cloud, digitalization is actually becoming top of most businesses' agendas, those who have not completed it. And it's in part, it's because of the need to get better tools and be able to link them up better. But there's been a lot of security scares which have gone on, I think, or which we know recently and through the COVID crisis, which are really concerning, I think, for on-prem instances and the older tools. Because actually, the data we're dealing with, the back office data, is the most critical to the operation of the businesses. So I don't know about you, but I am just seeing a huge push to get everything into the cloud and digitalize it at the moment.
Absolutely. So I think, again, COVID really helped us as an organization really fasten up our approach to that, because a lot of our legacy systems, like a lot of healthcare organizations and providers, the legacy systems have been in place for a long time. They're very expensive, they're very cumbersome to move, they take a lot of resource to do that. But yes, absolutely, InHealth is on that journey to move its legacy systems to the cloud, because the journey, whilst the journey is cumbersome and difficult, once you get there, the security elements, the capability of connecting the dots, the reduction of work, and actually focus on some of that data being much better used and much better protected is really important. And it's really interesting. I have had some really interesting conversations with fellow colleagues internally and externally about some of those data provisions and securities. And I think there's obviously always that, do you host it yourself or do you host it externally? But those security issues remain, whether you do it yourself or you do it remotely. And I think it's just about taking a really consolidated approach and safe approach to doing the controls that you can do from that cybersecurity perspective. But obviously, it's not a reason to stop, and it's not a reason not to move. And when you think some of the banks have been doing this a long time, this is the right reason to follow in the footsteps of some of those more regulated providers that are much more ahead of the game than healthcare is.
Yes, because the banks are, you're absolutely right. In financial services, that regulation is of the back office services is stronger. I mean, in health, sorry, not in health, but
not in
in
health,
the
but in
health sector,
healthcare.
regulation is really high, but it's not necessarily directed in this particular direction. I think there's a lot to be learned from that journey, which financial services and the compliance teams, etc., have been doing in financial services as well. So how many robots have you got going, Leanne, and what do they do?
So we've got 4 robots at the moment. So Michelangelo and Raphael are busy working with our teams. Michelangelo's with HR at the moment and is due to move to IT in the middle of July to help them with the back-end lever process and some of the AD and setting up and licensing administration that can be all automated. And then our Raphael robot is actually with our procurement team at the moment, looking at supplier onboarding and automating all the credit checks and getting suppliers up and running in our systems. And then we'll move to look at the changes and the removal of those suppliers. And then it's also working with our accounts receivable team on a billing process that has been a process we've looked at for 5 years and not been able to do anything with. And already the automation is stood up and is in design phase. So we are really excited about something like that, because 5 years work of trying to re-engineer it linearly, looking at it end-to-end, waterfall methodology, just hasn't worked for us. Whereas we're doing this agile, we're doing this with Raphael the robot, and suddenly we've got a design phase that we could put into production probably early August. So it's we've got these 2 robots working very hard. Donatello at the moment is doing a lot of review for our patient booking systems and how we can, with some of the quality and audit data checks, how we can actually automate some of that for our teams. That's quite a significant amount of time. Specifically, something really passionate that I have is that there is a piece in the system where we get notifications about patient statuses. So things like notifications of maternities or where they don't need to be screened because they're maternity. Those things are really important. So actually getting the robot to do some of those things where we can't afford to make an error. And then the other area is with our GP referrals, I was mentioning earlier. So we've got Donatello looking at that as well. But Leonardo at the moment is idle. He's enjoying his holiday.
That's very interesting, because each of those areas you've described are actually crossing much more territory than you would normally expect from a shared service. This is not simply back office staff, but you're actually dealing with critical operational areas and commercial areas as well. This is, this isn't just simply filing away or something like that, or securing data. This is about actually bringing change. Which one's your favourite out of the 3 workers?
But of my robots,
yes,
Michelangelo is my favourite. He's very fun.
Why?
He's got the personality of HR team, and obviously I'm from HR, so it has to be the Michelangelo robot. But also because he's extremely innovative. So what we do is, I know it sounds very funny, but what we've done with him is actually put him in the room and said, what would Michelangelo think? Because what we do is we go, let's get out of our own heads and put ourselves into Michelangelo's head. What would Michelangelo do with this process if he could do anything he wanted, no holds barred? So that's why he's my favourite at the moment, because I think he's coming to life much more than the others. And I think over the time, Michelangelo will be very much the robot to go and be innovative, and how can we come up with new ideas.
So do you think it's actually inspiring the team to think in a different way?
Very much so. I've seen it. I mean, I've seen it with the conversations I've had with the HR team. I'm seeing it with the conversations with the IT service desk. I'm seeing it with the patient referral centre. Those conversations are much easier when it's not in your own head. When you talk about what the robot's going to do. Yeah,
that is an interesting dimension. It's one I haven't heard before, which is the idea that actually having that the robots being there are, one, doing their own work more efficiently and all that stuff, but then creating a different mindset amongst the team, I think, is fascinating, making them think about it in a different way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. So What are your next steps for transformation? So what's your journey going forward, Leanne?
So
What's next?
we've actually put together an automation strategy. So over the last 4 weeks, we've been developing an automation strategy with our shared services leaders. So each
Mhm.
of the leaders across our organisation, I've taken them through what are the principles that we want to have, what are the guiding principles, and we've got a really exciting strategy of trying to save 6 million minutes of time. So we've actually given targets to each of the sites of 2 million minutes each. We want to try and reach that. I mean, I'd love to. I'd be so delighted if we did. We've identified about 5.5 million minutes. So whether we do all of them or whether as we progress, we see that those are actually more than we thought, which should be great. But we've actually targeted a small space of time. And the reason we've done that is we want to run at this quite quickly. We don't want this to become just BAU. We want people to be focused, creating that sense of urgency in the back end. So one of the things we've done is say, right, we're gonna focus on these 5 things for the next 3 months, and then once we've done those, we'll then move on to these 5 things. And we've been really very clear about what we're going to do. Now, obviously, we might change that along the way if something comes up or priorities change. But we've set a strategy out for 3 clear principles. One, to change the experience of the users, so the customers we have, but also the experience of the people in those roles. 2, to create cost effectiveness through efficiencies. So finding, being able to do more with the same, which is really important. And then thirdly is creating those connections to those new roles of the future of work. And that one is really important because I have not shied away at one point from any point of my journey of saying to people who are in these roles that are very highly automatable that we need to move them into new things. And a great example was, as I said earlier, about the patient referral person I spoke to. What would you do if you weren't doing this? Those are the things that we need to identify to create those roles of the future, ones that we may not even have today, that actually will really add value to that patient journey and those provision of those services that we just don't even have the sight of right now, because sometimes we're just so head down doing the transactional, we sometimes forget to look up and see actually what do I need to do here to add value to the patient.
And that something that occurs to me is that many of our fellow professionals in companies are finding the last months really de-energizing. Hard work, grind, repetitive stuff, all that. How are you maintaining the required energy in your team? So what are you doing to hold that team together and keep their energy levels up during both doing their more work than they've had to do before and also working and focusing on this transformation?
Yeah, it's really hard. I'm not going to shy away from it. It's really hard. But there are some key things that have really worked well for us. And I think I've been quite surprised about how energetic people have been, considering that burnout that is clearly there, and especially within our organisation, because nobody stopped. They've been working, harder than ever on these patient delivery services. So I think there's a couple of things. One is constant communication. So not just sending out an email, not just sending out, an update, being consistently telling the same story over and over again. And the most important thing in that story is not about what you're doing or what you've done or what the link is to the organisation. All those things are extremely important. It's actually about what's in it for them. And that has been the absolute number one focus of me. And I think it comes from my background of being in HR. But you have to make it very clear what's in it for me. Because the people I've spoken to, I do not think I would have their hearts and minds if I didn't have very, very clear line of sight between what we're trying to do and what's in it for them. And
Yeah.
that has been the number one connector that we have seen with the people that I'm working with. And I think seeing yesterday, and it was very emotional yesterday, we saw our robot go live yesterday. And my HR team, my old HR team, sorry, their faces light up. That meant we had nailed that line of sight, because their faces lit up and their words were, this is amazing. I am going to be able to spend the time on the things that matter, the moments that matter in our own employees' journeys. I'm not going to be spending time moving data from one place to another because the system either doesn't do it or it's one system to another that doesn't talk. And that was great. And having those testimonies to other people who are in similar positions in other areas has been extremely important.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, I think that that's a real challenge which we're all facing, which is trying to, over what is now a really prolonged period, keep the energy levels. And actually, if I'm really fair about it, actually maintaining energy levels pre-COVID was troublesome because shared services, internal services, this kind of back office work is often has been repetitive and has been, a bit of a grind for many of us. It's quite exciting because you're actually generating, I think that momentum, you're generating it in bite-sized chunks. And I think that's, that is totally different from the nature of the work. So if I am processing AR invoices, for example, and doing AR, then, the one thing I know for sure is when I process that pile, there's another pile behind it.
Yeah.
Right. And therefore, the nature of the work is kind of like this endless thing. And therefore, creating this way to break that up so that you're creating an energy within it is actually both critical and quite hard to do, I think, but really important. Because who wants to be looking? Because you can all on an AR journey, you can always look into your career future as well. It's not just tomorrow's pile; it's 10 years away pile.
Absolutely. And also for them, what is that career path? Because I think, not everyone wants to go on a financial career path. Not everyone in HR wants to go on a HR career path. We have to be thinking about the future of work and connecting these individuals who are doing work that is absolutely needed but isn't necessarily as value adding to them, to work that matters to them, that then they do that thing I was saying earlier about if they're delighted as an individual, they will delight their customers, and that's getting to the intrinsic heart of that person. That is the most important piece because as I've said to you, Tom, before, we have to work 5 days of our week if we're full time. We need to do things that we love.
So tell us, Leanne. One of the questions we've got is, what did you work on with Peter Jones? And is he as grumpy in real life as he is on TV?
So he's not. He's wonderful to work for, inspirational to work for. Really, really business minded. I got a lot of commercial experience from him. Really enjoyed working with him. And I actually, my claim to fame is I worked on the hair extensions investment that he actually made on Dragon's Den. So I actually worked with the lady on that. So to set up her HR and her contracts for all her new people that she needed to do the investment. So yeah, that's my claim to fame.
That's very interesting. Hair extensions. Did it go well? Was it a good bet he took there?
Very much so. Very, very profitable business.
Now, what advice would you give to people just starting their HR career? Yeah.
Oh, I've got so much of this. Okay, so my number one thing is think about your customer. Think about what your customer needs, what they need you to deliver, and the insights that you can have. I think if you are just starting and you're maybe entering into the world of HR at the administration level or the operations level, use that as a learning bed to understand how data transfers and how data is connected, because that gives you those lovely, deep people insights. And I think that the most important thing about the people I see that have been very successful, and I've been lucky enough to have lots of people in my team over the years that have been very successful, is they really understand their customer and how the people side can actually affect and improve and deliver business profitability. So it's linking the business performance with the people. And that is the most important thing that I can say that you need to do, and come up with innovative ideas on how to do it. And read, and more read. Papers, as many things as you can get.
That's really interesting. It kind of brings us to full circle back to what we first talked about, which is your original experience in the aviation industry with BA, etc. Because I think one of the things which they brought in back in the day was this kind of dealing with customers on a personal level, but also turning customer interactions into a process. So thinking not about individual customers and their needs, but thinking about what are the needs of customers so that you could deal with them individually. Because it really was revolutionary at the time where we were starting, where the process was customer you were going to ask, what your needs were, etc., and then working out mechanisms to deliver that piece. And maybe it's more important than even you think, Leanne, that your background was originally was back there, because everything you've described to us is, is an extension and refinement of that.
Very much so, very much so.
But before we finish, and I'd like to thank you very much, Leanne, and everyone else for joining. But just before we finish, you mentioned that you're doing a lot of reading at the moment. What are you reading, Leanne, and what would you recommend that we pick up?
I would definitely recommend Surrounded by Idiots by Thomas Erickson. It's one of my favourite books, and I do go back to it quite often. I think people and working with people is an art, and it's also a science. So I think I would really recommend that book. I think anybody would find that easy to read and would identify it with it. The other book I've got is actually right here. It's called Little Big Things by Tom Peters, and it just gives you really small snippets of things that just make a difference for excellence in your life and your work. So just small little tips every day, and I try and read one of those a day.
Oh wow, one a day. Good for you, Leanne. That's great. And I love your conversation about the services we provide are both an art and a science.
Yes.
And that's what I'm going to take away today, which is actually that, you've talked about Michelangelo, Donatello, Leonardo, and then they're robots as well. They're artists and scientists. And I think that is a really exciting idea, along with a humanization of the services we provide. So Leanne, can I thank you very much for all your insights today. I have learned a lot, and that was really exciting event. And thank you everyone else for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks everyone.